My name is Lance Davison, and I'm the current president of the chapter. And we wanted to first thank everybody that's been involved all the way since Saturday and before, starting with the tree climbing championship. How many people have been here for the last 3 days? Excellent.
He has been a principal with Hort Science Incorporated as an arboriculture and urban forestry consultant since 1991. He received his Bachelor's of Science in Plant Science from Rutgers University in 1973 and followed by a Master's of Science in Horticulture in 1975. He went on to get his PhD from the University of California, Davis in 1979. So he's been around here for a long time, and we're quite excited about having him back to speak with us again. He's the co-author of several prominent books, including Arboriculture and the Integrated Management of Landscape Trees, Shrubs, and Vines. He has served on the board of directors of the Western Chapter ISA, the ISA, and the American Society of Consulting Arborists. He's currently ASCA's representative to and chair of the Council of Tree and Landscape Appraisers. Jim is an ISA certified arborist. He's an ISA tree risk assessment qualified professional, a registered consulting arborist of the American Society of Consulting Arborists, and an honorary life member of both the ISA and the Western Chapter, as well as an all-around good guy. Please help me welcome Jim Clark.
Thank you, Ian. Morning, everybody. Good morning. Even you over there in the far, thank you. Thank you for waving. It's always a joy to come to the Pacific Northwest Chapter. It's not just because of my relationship with the chapter in the 1980s. It's because of the culture of the chapter and the people who you cultivate and honor as they participate in our industry. So I've been to a lot of chapters, and it's always a joy to come back to the PNW chapter. And by that you should take the meaning that it's not always a joy to go to other places, but it is always a joy to be here. And so today I get the honor, the privilege of being your keynote speaker, and Christina asked me about talking something about trees in a changing world, and we have about an hour and 15 minutes, which seems like an enormously long period of time. So I may have us take a stand-up break here in the middle, and we'll just see how the timing goes. Well, let me say it this way. I'm going to talk about change. Then I'm going to talk about changes in tree biology over time. I'm going to talk about how trees die, and then I'm going to talk about management strategies, things that we can do to enhance longevity, recognizing the three things that go before. And I have to tell you that I'm going to be giving you all sorts of references, and you're going to flash URLs up in front of you. Just a second. Ian, what does URL stand for?
You're going to trick me on that one.
Uniform Resource Locator? Universal Resource Locator, I think. Remote Locator. So there'll be URLs as well as the traditional references that I am familiar with. And those are all contained in a handout that you can download from the website. And I believe if you go to the conference website, there's actually a link there now, and here's the URL. Ian can get it for you if you need it. It was Darwin that said it's not the strongest of species that survive, nor the most intelligent, but the ones most responsive to change. One day you're walking your daughter to elementary school, and the next day she wants the car keys. One day you're taking your son off to college and saying goodbye, and then the next day he wants to move back home with you. One day you're taking care of your infants, and then a few days later you're taking care of your aging parents. It just comes by us in a routine sort of way, and we oftentimes miss the significance of that change, even though it's occurring all around us. And I'll give you a few predictors. We're not so good at predicting change, but when I finish this little section, I'll mention it to you. So since we have a little time, I'd like to start with, I'm going to show you a video. Actually, I'm going to try and show you a video. What does it all mean? Right, the trees are just standing out there growing, and the world around them is changing as quickly as we can imagine. In my personal view, this has everything to do with the trees. How we communicate and how we live our lives and what's important in our lives is directly related to how we care for trees and how we think about them. So I appreciate your patience in giving me a big picture view of some of the technological changes that have occurred in our lives and will continue to occur. There's no reason to expect, in fact, there's every reason to believe that technology will change faster in the next 20 years than it has in the last 20 years. And a fun fact that was not in this year's version of Shift Happens is, you remember that segment about time to reach an audience of 50 million and Facebook was 2 years? Well, there was a slide for a while in there of Candy Crush something, 2 hours, that it took 50 million to get to Candy Crush. I'm not a Candy Crush player myself. I bet there are a few in the room. Shift Happens, the video you just saw was a project of a high school in Centennial, Colorado in 2006. And the teachers there wanted their students to learn about technology, and this was the result. And if you go to the internet, of all things, and you Google Shift Happens, there are a dozen different versions, and someone out there is updating it every year, and it's just astonishing to me. The first time I saw it, it took my breath away. So that leads me to a couple of technology questions. I think the most scary thing for me, the most unsettling fact in Shift Happens is that India and China have more kids than we have more honors kids than North America has kids. That somehow really bothers me. And it bothers me even more that in the United States, some percentage of the population lacks access to broadband internet. So if we think about the need to be able to access information on the internet, like Yelp reviews for who you're going to hire as your tree care company, or a tree removal permit from your municipality that is online, or even any basic information, you might wonder which of these numbers. It's about 25% is the current estimate of families that lack access to broadband internet. In Canada, the number is lower. It's about 18% based on what I most recently found. And you can imagine there is both a geographic and an economic link to access to broadband internet. The further you are from center city and the less well off you are, it's less likely that you have access. Now, this is called the digital divide, in case you've ever heard anyone talk about it. It's not just between me and my teenagers, it's across society. And I don't usually do this, but I'm going to make what might be considered a political comment because the guy in the Federal Communications Commission, Michael O'Reilly, I'm sure he's a nice person, uttered these words: people do a disservice by overstating the digital divide's relevancy or stature in people's lives. People can and do live without internet access, and many lead very successful lives. Well, they may have done that, but I think, I don't have anything more to say. let's change our tune from changes in society and changes in the environment, and let's talk about environmental change for a minute. So this is a paper. It was a poster, a publication from the Forest Service, U.S. Forest Service, that came out a couple years ago, and they had measured drought indices over 50 years. Right, so spatio-temporo is, across space and time in the conterminous U.S., continental U.S. So here's 1960 to 1986. Now, the more intense the color, the greater the drought intensity, right, by the Palmer Drought Index. So there's 1960, those 25 years. Here's the next 25 years. See the difference? Now, this work does not predict that drought will continue into the future. It's simply reflecting the fact that over the past 50 years, there was a period of sort of moderate drought, and then we had 25 years in the continental U.S. of fairly severe drought. And a drought that probably, if we ask today, is still continuing, and certainly in many parts of the West. Even though, we had record rainfalls in California last season, it doesn't change the fact that we had 4 consecutive years of drought, which led our state legislator to put on mandatory water restrictions for irrigation of 25%. Actually, we had across-the-board water use reductions by 25%. And, associated with that drought is an increased number of fires and other activities. And one of the results of that was, I think, a very important link between urban forestry and the State Water Resources Board in a program that was called Save Our Water, Save Our Trees, which was aimed at watering trees in a way to keep them alive and healthy through this drought, even if we were going to eliminate turf and we're going to do some other things. And it was really one of the first times, I think, in our state where our interest, the interest of urban foresters and arborists, was able to be linked directly to state water use. And more of that will happen in the future. And at the same time as this drought was occurring, in our state anyway, there is a conversion from using potable water to using recycled water for landscape irrigation purposes. You come to the Bay Area, and plants are still irrigated with water from the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir, some of the highest quality water in the United States, and we're using that to irrigate lawns. Well, that's got a short lifespan. Palo Alto, the city of Palo Alto has made a decision that within 10 years, they're going to convert all landscape irrigation to recycled water. And so any new project in town has to have piping in it for recycled water. And one of the issues for this is that recycled water can be poorer, can be less quality than potable water, and at some quality levels can adversely affect landscape plants. And here's a photograph of London Plain with high chloride, and it's got burn, marginal burn. That would not be bad in its own right. If you we need to reduce irrigation, and then we're going to irrigate with recycled water. That has a profound effect on our species palette. And the tree species that's most likely to be directly affected by this is our coast redwood. And it seems unlikely to me that in the next 25 years we'll be planting coast redwood, because it's a very high water use species, and it is also intolerant to poor quality recycled water. The solution in recycled water is managing the quality at the place where it's produced, and so far that hasn't been a successful avenue for us. They want to sell a quality that's economic and for them, rather than a quality that's going to be good for the landscape. I think that will change, but I'm not sure that we'll see redwood in the landscape in the Bay Area outside of its native range. We just can't put enough water on it to keep it alive. That's a profound change. Another change that is environmental change that our East Coast is experiencing, we don't experience it nearly as much on the West Coast, is something called sunny day flooding. So here we are in Miami. You'll notice the sky is blue, the palm trees are green, and the tide water is blue. So these are tides that are, like not just regular high tides that result in flooding. And why is that? It's because the sea level has risen, and Miami and other places along the eastern seaboard are so low-lying that a raise in tides and a raise in sea level changes the tidal patterns enough that places that used to be dry are now flooding. This is a graph for Atlantic City about the number of days of sunny day flooding and their intensity. Now, this is not storm-related flooding of Hurricane Sandy or Irma or Harvey or Jose or Hurricane Hoosthagen. These are just regular day-to-day tides, sunny day flooding. And in San Francisco, we call them king tides. And they do have a tendency to flood across the Great Highway on the edge of the coast. And so every now and then when we have a storm or we have a king tide, a quarterly moon event, the Great Highway gets closed because of flooding. This is not something we've done. The world, well, a little bit of the world is sinking, but the sea level is rising. How about 9-banded armadillos? I couldn't pick a more, that's a face only a mom could love. So yeah, I know exactly. Do we have a pointer here, Ian? I guess we don't. Okay. Point it with the mouse. Oh, you mean like this? Like use technology like I was, under 30? And you got it on the right side of it. Okay, forget about it. See where that mouse is? Down there in South Texas? So in 1885, about 1885, the armadillo crossed the Rio Grande River. Right? This is a Central American and South American animal. And it has, since the two continents met in the Isthmus of Panama, armadillo has been slowly but surely making its way north because it can. Not because of any particular change. It's just this animal, we don't hunt it, other animals don't eat it. It likes to eat anything and it'll live just about anywhere. And it is slowly but surely changing its range as we speak. So in 1885, it was down there in South Texas. And by 1995, it's in the dark shaded green. There are some range maps for armadillos that show how it has been spotted in 200 miles north of that 1995 range. And there's every reason to expect that at a future PNW chapter meeting, you'll be talking about finding armadillos because it'll cut across the desert and then come up the coast, and the next thing you know, you'll be hitting them on I-5 and wondering, what was that thing I just ran over? Now, this is a change, it's not related to any environmental change that we're aware of. It's just the normal thing that happens as armadillo's territory expands. Other species, their territory is contracting, and that includes many of our plants. So if we look in California at the distribution and native range of Monterey pine, Monterey cypress, Torrey pine, 4 or 5 other conifers, they have been pushed to the edge of the continent, and with a good earthquake, their entire native range can be destroyed. The range of Monterey cypress, the natural range of Monterey cypress, is about two small stands that are probably less in size than Volunteer Park in Seattle. No, Volunteer and what's the one on the coast in Magnolia? Discovery Park. So 2 parks, its native range is smaller than the square footage of those parks because it just can't compete as the climate has gotten warmer and drier in California, those conifers have just had a tough time. And they've been pushed out to the edge of the continent or pushed up higher in elevation. And as we try to conserve them, we're really working against the forces of nature, which has changed over time, resulting in these distributions, these crazy distributions. So my example for you, I don't have a PNW example of this, but I'll give you jacaranda. So jacaranda is a flowering tree that you'll see in San Jose, California as a street tree. Right? It's a common landscape and park tree, you'll see it. But 30 miles north in Pleasanton, it's only marginally hardy. Now what does that mean, marginally hardy? That means it dies out every 10 or 12 years, right? It freezes back, and so it's hard to make a real tree because it freezes back to the trunk, and then you get resprouting and so forth. Well, all it would take would be to change that cold pattern from once every 10 or 12 years to once every 20 or 25 years, and this tree would be a regular landscape tree in Pleasanton. It's only that change that would be required. And that's going to happen. We'll see that change occur. I have told the parks people in Pleasanton, let's plant some jacarandas and see what happens. You can just plant a half dozen. Let's see what happens and see how well they develop, because we're getting warmer, right? We're getting less cold temperature damage, and it's occurring right around us as we speak. So let me just stop with change. It's the society that changes, our culture, our environment, trees change as well. Now, if you don't think that this is occurring, I'll ask you two questions. I'll give you two examples. The first is, many of you have children in elementary school or grandchildren in elementary school. Are they learning to write cursive writing? It's all over the map. In some schools, they're no longer teaching cursive, and then in other schools, they're continuing to teach cursive. But it's really a dying art. I'm afraid that I think my kids tell me, my son and daughter-in-law tell me, well, we want our son to be able to sign his name. And I say, do you see my signature? Do you think you can read that? Is that a cursive written signature? No, it's a scratch. I could be better off writing an X. They might be more traditional than me. They have the kid, I don't have the kid. It's over. Another thing is, John and I, in another 10 years, our children are going to be telling us that we should be giving up driving. Dad, maybe it's time you gave up the car keys. Well, John and I are going to face that question, because by the time I'm at 75, I'm going to be having an autonomous vehicle show up in my front yard, or it's either going to be in my driveway, or I'm going to call it from Uber, and I'm going to say, take me to the office and stop at the coffee shop on the way, and the car will just do that. There are approximately 25 companies in the Bay Area that are testing driverless cars. I think we're calling them autonomous vehicles these days. Every now and then you can see the Google car go by and there's nobody in the driver's seat. There's a guy sitting in the passenger seat, and it's just driving down the freeway. And this is something that we will see. The only question for John and I is, will we be able to afford it, a vehicle of our own, or will we be using a drive service like Uber or Lyft? That's the only question that's going to happen. But we're going to get in the car, and we're going to type in on our on our phone, our mobile device, where we want to go, and it's just going to take us there. No tipping, John, when we have autonomous driving. We don't have to tip. And if you don't think those two things are happening, you got your eyes closed, because they're right there in front of us. All right, let's talk about something that we're more familiar with, changes in tree biology over time. I think we all know that the biology and development of young trees differs from that of old trees. Our focus today is on mature trees, so I'm not really going to talk to you about early tree care. I'm going to remind you of something that Goff and West said in 1975, that trees slow in growth as they reach maximum age and become more vulnerable to disease, wind, and other causes of death. Now, there's a couple things embedded in this idea. The first is that trees have a maximum age, that they have a lifespan, a fixed lifespan. And the second thing is that mature trees, older trees, are more susceptible, more vulnerable to the forces of nature as well as insect and disease problems and other causes of death. We'll talk about death in just a minute. So what are some of those changes? The first is a declining growth rate. So that if we were to look at the growth rate, whether it's height or diameter of trees as they mature, that growth rate declines. It's not really surprising that trees reach a maximum height and then stay at about that height for very long periods of time, while diameter does increase at a much slower rate. And recently there have been some really fun papers about the amount of mass that a very old redwood or a very old Douglas fir can produce. And so these trees continue to produce lots of carbon every year for many years within that fixed lifespan. Second thing is that there's a decreased investment in defense. And defense is the chemical and structural features that resist decay, herbivory, wind, and fire. So these might be the strengthening aspects or reactive aspects that are going to pitch out. Insects are going to produce chemicals that are not palatable to insects or other herbivores that are browsing it. Is going to produce support wood or reaction wood that is going to react to areas of weakness on the trunk. Those are all extra things that get taken on. They're not the greatest hierarchy of needs in how a tree uses its resources. So as the tree ages, these investments become less. It's one of the reasons why large diameter conifers are more susceptible to bark beetle attacks because of this age and this defense. There's an increased susceptibility to insect and decline complexes, as I just said, and I'll talk about decline complexes in just a minute. I don't really have anything to say about bark beetles. You're very much familiar with that. So then there's a decreased tolerance to disturbance and change. So what I used to say is that, older trees are like, me. I'm settled in my ways. And, I don't want to upgrade my iPhone. I didn't want to give up a Palm device, let alone, wind up using a Kindle now to collect data. And, so you can think of that in the trees. They're stable, they're living in this particular environment for many decades or hundreds of years. And when we start to mess with them, which is disturb them, it takes a long time for them to react. Now, I will say, I found a paper that says that's not true. So here's a paper from about 250-year-old lodgepole pines. Okay, so that's a mature stance of lodgepole pine. And these stands were thinned right here where the dotted line is. So on the stand B, it happened right here. In stand A, it happened right there in 1985. And then this is the reaction. You are killing me, Ian. This is the reaction in stand B. There was a sharp increase in growth rate, and then it has tapered off. And this is the reaction in this stand, another sharp increase. Notice there's quite a bit of variability there. So that would say, if you thin a ponderosa pine stand, the trees that are remaining react, and they can actually tolerate that change. And the authors attributed the increase in growth to an increased available moisture, which really says, which is so logical. If you've got X number of trees and you reduce that in half, it means the same amount of moisture is going to be available to fewer trees. Of course, they're going to have better moisture balance. That's a lesson for us when we're managing trees in urban areas that are susceptible or under drought stress. And so I don't have a particular answer to, does this mean that old trees are a lot more adaptable than we think? I'm I'm going to say I'll leave that question open for right now based on the research. So those are the four things that we have in, as trees change with time: a decline in growth rate, an increase in investment, decrease in investment, increased susceptibility to insect and disease complexes, decreased tolerance to change and disturbance. Another aspect of long lifespan is increased size and complexity. You know, this doesn't happen to us, right? We reach our mature size early on in our life, and we spend decades trying to maintain that. We don't continue to grow, and as this tree continues to grow, it has to add a translocation system that allows each individual root tip to access every little shoot tip. And that's a complicated highway that water and mineral elements and carbohydrates have to move through. And here's some data from one of Steve Sillick's papers that if you take a 35-year-old coast redwood, it's about 1.5 tons of dry mass and about 8 million needles. Don't ask me how they estimated this. I'm glad I wasn't one of the graduate students. But as we get to the tree being 1,000 years old, the mass is 333,000 pounds, and there's 461 million needles. Now just remember, each of those needles has to have a vascular connection to it, right? It needs to be able to access the vascular system, and it needs to have water and mineral elements and carbohydrates available, accessible to it. That's a complicated highway system. So then let's talk about how trees die. They die in a biotic manner. In abiotic or non-living, we can poison them with hydrochloric acid or Garlon. You don't even know what Garlon is. They may result from decline syndromes, or they may fail. So I want to talk about a couple of these. I'm simply going to put structural failure on the side, not say anything about it. You know, we're all familiar with structure and structural stability. Even purple leaf plums can fail, and will do so, and so that's all I'm going to say about structural failure. Instead, I want to talk about biotic and to a much lesser extent, abiotic things. Everyone recognizes this as emerald ash borer, don't you? Now let's see, I don't think that in my career, whatever I have left, we'll see emerald ash borer in Washington. But it's pretty clear that in Lance and Ian's time, you'll see emerald ash borer. That we just have not been able to stop the distribution and increase in range of this insect. And I wish we could. Maybe you will do a better job than the East Coast did. So this is an insect that was first seen in the United States and the Midwest in the 1990s, and then it disappeared for a while. And it reappeared in 2002 in really what reached epidemic proportions. And infestations in the US and Canada have killed millions of trees. And so I want to show you a couple of pictures. This is this year's August 1st distribution map for emerald ash borer. And one of the very interesting, this is an insect that is a very poor flyer. So adults can fly about 3 miles. When they emerge from the tree and develop and start distributing, ranging outward, looking for new trees, they get about 3 miles. But the insect has moved from Iowa, Missouri to Boulder, Colorado. It seems somewhat ironic that it would get to Boulder, given Boulder's reputation. So how did the insect get across Kansas? Well, it probably got across Kansas on firewood. The most likely explanation for the increase in range of this insect is it's moved around by us, either on firewood or in some way with which we are unfamiliar. Right? We're carrying it around with us. And that's why there's every reason to believe that it's eventually going to get to Oregon, Washington, Idaho, British Columbia, California, etc. etc. Here's a bit of a threat map. This is a couple years old, so all the red dots are where there are infestations of emerald ash borer, and the green is the places where native ashes exist, and then there are these little areas of yellow where there are urban areas where ashes have been populated, are present. And so you can imagine once it gets to the west coast, it'll be able to move up or down the coast and into British Columbia. It should be able to do that without any trouble. It's unclear whether it's going to be limited by heat. So, this is about 7 minutes.
We're working on the lights, everyone.
Just bear with me.
lights.
At the tree, if you were a golfer on this course, you would never know that the tree was pruned. And I think, of course, that is always what I regard as the ultimate compliment to an arborist, is that you do a lot of work, and then, your client doesn't even notice that anything was happening to the tree. So I want to emphasize, I think this idea of weight management, balancing, maintaining forward, and managing weight is one of the delicate things that we need to do, particularly on deciduous trees. So if we think about pruning as a stress, what's the ANSI pruning standard say about dose on the pruning of mature trees? It says two things. The first thing it says in the general sort of BMP, it says 25%, right? And then the most recent, there's a pruning standard coming out, but the most recent standard, later back in the text, it says mature trees probably 10%. Don't remove more than 10% of the canopy at any one time. And I bet that's going to be clarified in the third edition of the BMP, pruning BMP, because Ed Gilman's more actively involved in it. And he has, really struck that we should be maintaining as much foliage as we can on mature trees and not pruning them nearly as much. And I think we'll see a much more restrictive 10% of the canopy recommendation in the BMP. It may not be a shall in the standard itself. Tree care applies specific general principles to specific genotypes. And I think it's really critical that we understand the species that we're dealing with. This is not just, and by this I mean, we need to understand the amount of variation that constitutes normal and abnormal. Now, we need to see enough trees that we can tell what's normal and abnormal. We need to know the failure patterns, and we need to know how a tree responds to treatment. So I want to mention Outliers. This is a book by Malcolm Gladwell. And in Outliers, it was published probably 8 or 10 years ago maybe now. In Outliers, Gladwell cites some work that deals with the 10,000 hour rule. Anybody heard about this? Heard about the debunking of the 10,000 hour rule? The emerging picture is that 10,000 hours of practice is required to achieve the level of mastery associated with becoming a world-class expert in anything. Now, Malcolm Gladwell admits, I took some liberties with this research, and he extended it to some more general things. But the idea that we need long periods of time of focused practice to become masters of our craft is a sound one, has been demonstrated again and again. And my daughter Maureen has told me many times, no, Dad, it's not practice that makes perfect. It's perfect practice that makes perfect. And this relates directly to the 10,000-hour rule, which requires that it's disciplined, focused practice. So it's not just, we're not just like sliding along, looking at the tree, doing a drive-by. We're doing an intense look at the tree's health and structure. So that leads to the question that I've asked in the Western chapter a number of times: how many blue gums do I have to look at before I become an expert in blue gums? And you can have the same thing. That at some point we need to be familiar with the variation in the normal development of a tree species on its own as a specimen and when it's grown in stands. We need to know what to look for or be able to recognize a tree that's in distress or stress. We need to be able to know how these trees respond to treatment like topping or heading or any other kind of treatments. We need to know how they respond to root severance during construction. This is part of us learning about each species and becoming masters of our craft. Seeing 10 or 12 blue gums does not quite do it. And I have become more and more convinced that one of the great benefits I've had is being able to go out and look at trees over and over again, seeing the same species, and becoming familiar with that natural variation is. Part of that understanding the species is understanding the lifespan. Many North American species have a fairly well-documented lifespan. We're not clear about how that lifespan is impacted when we move the tree outside its native range. Certainly the general theme, I would say, is that the potential lifespan is reduced. It's not increased when we move it outside its natural range. And you can go to references like Silvics of the United States, Silvics of Forest Trees of North America, Craig Laley's 1988 paper, and he lists typical lifespans and maximum lifespans for many North American species. And we're aiming at the typical lifespan, right? We shouldn't be looking over at the maximum column. We should be thinking about the typical lifespan is when most trees die. It's the unusual tree that makes it longer than that. And so we know there's a clear range in variation. Where we are, purple leaf plum, 25-year tree, cut it down. Lombardy poplar, 25-year tree, cut it down. Raywood ash, 35-year tree, cut it down. And these are just normal. You can just see this pattern. Nothing I'm going to do is going to make a purple leaf plum live for 100 years. Another thing we can do is understand the failure patterns of these trees, and since I want to leave a couple minutes for questions, I'm not going to say too much about where this information is from and how you used it as the California Tree Failure Report Program. And I want to show you this graph. So this is a graph of failures, reported failures, through the year, January through December, and for trunk, root, and branch failure. And one of the things that you'll see about this, there's two really striking messages to me that come from this graph. The first message is almost all of our root and trunk failures occur during the rainy, wet storm season. That they occur in our winter months when in my part of the world we get our most severe storms, the soils are most likely saturated, etc. Now one of the things about that is when it's rainy and windy and stormy, except for golfers, most people are not outside using parks and other recreation facilities, right? When it's rainy and stormy, most of us are not camping, we're not playing disc golf. Okay, golfers and dog walkers. There's much lower intensity use during storm events. A second thing that is striking about this graph for blue gum is notice that elevation in branch failures during the summer. Right, so this is really a phenomenon of summer branch drop. These are now normally occurring branches that don't have defects. If I looked at a blue gum, could I predict which branch is going to be susceptible to summer branch drop? No, not at all. And it does tell me that if we're going to have blue gums, we need to manage the weight on those branches or manage their use, because it is possible that we're going to get summer branch drop during hot, no wind conditions. So then I can turn to valley oak. Valley oak is another one of our very common species, and the key thing about failure patterns in it is most of the trunk and root failures are associated with decay. So in blue gum, it's less of a number, it's a smaller number, but in both trunk and root failures, in valley oak, there's a high proportion that are related to decay. It makes decay detection and evaluation in this species much more of a key focus. Here's its failure pattern. Not nearly as neat and clean as blue gum. Notice the high number of failures during midsummer, specifically in August, of branch failures. We have not been able to do, we arborists have not been able to do a good job at managing weight on valley oaks. And there are always this normal looking limbs that fail during the midsummer. And it is an unsettling pattern that has developed through these 260 reports of failure. So I can't emphasize enough our need to understand the species of tree that we're working with, the variation of normal to abnormal, and its failure patterns. So those are the comments that I want to make. I've talked about change. Shift happens. I've talked about changes in tree biology over time, a topic of which is the subject of a great deal of research, particularly on the west here, and particularly in conifers. I talked about how trees die and how they're going to die in the future, and then I've talked a little bit about management strategies to enhance longevity. I think the key thing, one of the key things for me is that we manage mature trees in a way that's different than managing young trees. We strive for that stable environment and stable structure. We apply our treatments more sparingly and at a lower dose. We strive to develop good structure and then maintain it over the course of the tree's life. I think that's one key element that the research and our own observations tell us. And I think the second thing about this change is that we are going to be recipients, we are victims of change as it occurs. The environment is changing, whatever the causes of environmental change might be. It seems to me we can't deny that it's occurring. Just drive down through downtown Miami one day when the road to your house is flooded. Or you run over an armadillo and you think that never happened before. Or you're out working in an ash and you find an emerald ash borer. This changes around us whether we like it or not. We need to be adaptable to it because it's the species that it's not the strongest species, it's not the biggest species, it's the species that's most adaptable to change that's going to survive. Darwin said it over 100 years ago, and we're living it. We're living it as we speak. And with that, I'll say, it's always a joy to come to the Pacific Northwest Chapter. Thank you very, very much.
I think we have a bag. A little token of appreciation on behalf of the chapter for you. We may be a little bit out of time for questions right now, but he will be speaking again at 11 o'clock, and maybe address them at that time.
You can see me during the break, and I'll,